This is a 2020 Lincoln Aviator, and I've been waiting all year to review it. That's a pretty big deal because 10 years ago, Lincoln had an SUV called the Aviator, and it was generally agreed to be one of the worst luxury SUVs on sale. It was just a thinly rebadged Ford Explorer with cheap plastic everywhere. But that is no longer the case. The new Aviator is a completely different vehicle, and it proves that Lincoln is a completely different brand. I've borrowed this Aviator from Lincoln's South Coast, which is a gorgeous Lincoln dealership here in Orange County in Southern California. Lincoln South Coast is just starting to get in the new 2020 Aviator. In fact, it was hard to secure one for review because demand is just so intense. And with good reason. 2 years ago, Lincoln showed us how serious they were about returning to the top of the luxury car game with the new Navigator, which is an excellent full-size luxury SUV. Now, using lessons they learned from the Navigator, Lincoln is giving us the new Aviator, which is smaller. It's intended to compete with other mid-size three-row luxury SUVs like the Volvo XC90, the Lexus GX, the Audi Q7, and the Range Rover Sport. Yes, a Lincoln is competing with those brands, and it does a much better job than you might think. This Aviator is a top-of-the-line black label model with a sticker price of just over $80,000. Now, that's impressive money, but this is an impressive car. It uses a twin-turbo V6 with 400 horsepower, and Lincoln says they will soon come out with a plug-in hybrid version that has 494 horsepower and 630 pound-feet of torque. That is more torque than a BMW X5M. So today I'm going to show you around the Aviator, and I'm going to show you all of the interesting quirks and features of the latest Lincoln to rock the luxury SUV boat. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the Aviator, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also rounded up a list of some cool old school family wagons for sale on AutoTrader in case you'd prefer a wagon over an SUV. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Aviator before I even climb inside with just approaching it, because there are several interesting things that happen when you do, starting with the fact that it lowers several inches to make it easier to get inside. All right, check this out. I am walking up to the Aviator, and if you look closely, you can see it is actually dropping, and they do that so that it's easier to get in, so it's not so high off the ground. And it takes about 8 seconds for it to fully drop, and then you can walk up and climb inside, and then when you turn it on and start driving, it will raise itself back up to a normal ride height. You can check it out here again. I press the unlock button, and then you can see the Aviator actually lowers itself before you get inside to make it easier to do so. Pretty cool feature. And that isn't the only cool thing that happens when you approach the Aviator. Check this out. You walk up to this car, and the headlights acknowledge you by doing a little dance. You can see first the Lincoln badge in the grille turns on, and then the headlights sort of gradually turn on from the inside out to show you that they see you and to make it easier to identify your Aviator in a parking lot. That is a pretty cool little feature. And it's the same thing when you walk away. You press the lock button, and then the headlights gradually turn off, and the grille badge turns off last. Just a cool little Aviator quirk when you're approaching it. Now, if you approach the Aviator from the back, the taillights also do something sort of interesting, but it's not as cool as what happens up front. Basically, they also kind of turn on gradually, and same deal, if you lock it and walk away from the back, the taillights sort of turn off gradually, similar to what happens up in the front, but not quite as much fanfare going on back here. And I'm still not done with all the cool stuff that happens with the Aviator when you just approach it, or in this case, when you walk away. Now, if you're walking away from the Aviator and you want to lock it, you could press the lock button on your key fob, or you could tap this little icon on the side of the front door. It's a little lock, and it's unlocked when the car is unlocked. When you want to lock it, just tap the lock and then it becomes locked. And that is a really cool little touch, and it's a cool way to tell if your Aviator is unlocked or locked. Now, after a few seconds, it goes away completely so no one else can tell. And now finally starting to climb into the Aviator, but before I do, one interesting thing you notice when you go to open the door. This doesn't have a traditional door latch. Instead, the door latches are electronic. So you reach into the door handle and you just pull a little button and the door opens electronically. And that means that on the inside of the Aviator, you don't have traditional door latches, but instead you have buttons to press to get out. You press the button and the door pops open, and then you can open it from there. Now, you're probably thinking, well, what happens if you're in the Aviator and the battery dies? Are you trapped? Actually, Lincoln thought of that. There is an emergency backup door handle at the bottom of the interior door pocket. You pull it, and that will manually unlatch the door and open it in case the door mechanism isn't working or your battery is dead. Now, one other cool Aviator interior door thing, there are ambient lights on the interior door panel, whatever color you select. But when you open the door, the ambient light turns red, I guess to let you know that the door is open, but maybe also to let approaching traffic know that the door is open with a little bit of a brighter color. Close the door again, and it goes back to your typical ambient lighting color. A cool touch. Not that you will really notice any of that door stuff in this thing, because the truth is, when you open the door to the new Aviator, you will be absolutely consumed by the incredible quality of this interior. Let's start with the seats. The first thing you notice is that on the side of the seat headrest, there's this cool little silver trim with the Lincoln badge on it, but that just barely scratches the surface. The most impressive thing about the seats is that you can move them any way you want. And I mean any way. In your car, if you have power seats, you can move them maybe 4, maybe 6 or 8 ways. In this thing, 30-way power seats. Lincoln calls them perfect position seats. And indeed they are, because you can move them 30 different ways. It is absolutely crazy. And the craziest part is the fact that there are all sorts of seat controls on the door, but they barely scratch the surface of what you can do. Press the seat button and the infotainment screen pops up even more seat controls to give you the rest of your 30-way seats, including a rather impressive massage function, quite comprehensive, that you can change to various different levels and different types of massage for both driver and passenger seats. But my personal favorite seat control, though, has to go to the leg support. Now, drivers with longer legs will want the bottom of the seat to extend out a little bit to support their legs, and most luxury cars offer this feature. The way that the Lincoln perfect position seats differ, though, is that each leg can be adjusted individually. So if you want one leg to stretch out, you can stretch out that leg support, and if you want to keep the other leg like closer to the seat, you can put that leg support closer in. You can choose which one is which distance. Nobody else offers that, not even Rolls-Royce. And by the way, if 30-way power seats don't impress you, how about the fact that the interior of the new Aviator has 28 individual speakers for the sound system? They are everywhere. There are speakers above your head in the ceiling, and look at the ones on the door. Absolutely beautiful quality. They look fantastic. A great compliment to the high quality trim in this interior. And speaking of that high quality trim, take a look around and you will be absolutely amazed that this is a Lincoln and not a Mercedes, a BMW, maybe even a Bentley. Look in the center control stack at this beautiful aluminum trim. It looks like a vintage car or maybe a vintage airplane. This is the Aviator after all. Same deal on the dashboard. That trim is carried through there as well. But it's not just that. The stitching on the seats, absolutely gorgeous. The black trim in the center console is surrounded by all these little silver pieces that frame each individual item. It is a beautiful interior for a midsize SUV, unquestionably the best in the class. And another interesting luxury feature in this car, Lincoln wanted to make the Aviator as calm and luxurious as possible, and they decided to extend that to warning chimes. In your car, if a warning chime sounds like you don't have your seatbelt on, it's like ding, 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 and it's really annoying. But in this car, they wanted to make it a little bit more luxurious. So all the warning chimes are nicer, more friendly. Take a listen to my personal favorite, the chime that sounds when you open your door while the engine is running. And there are a couple of other quirks and features that make it notable to be in here, starting with the gear selector. It isn't an old school lever or even a new dial. Instead, it's these buttons at the top of the center control stack below the climate vents. You have P, R, N, and D. And that's how you move the car between gears, by pressing those buttons like piano keys. They feel good and they're cool. And speaking of buttons, the steering wheel in the Aviator has some rather interesting ones. To start, the button for voice control is at your left, like, thumb pad. So if you want to tell it to find a navigation destination, change the radio, you don't have to go hunting for a voice control button. Just tap your thumb on the steering wheel and it's right up there by itself, so you'll never mistake it for something else. That's pretty cool. But the steering wheel is more interesting than just that. Over on the right spoke of the steering wheel, there's this little joystick, and it offers you 4 options: navigation, phone, music, or settings. But if you go into any of those options, you can see that joystick has now changed its function, and now you can use it to go back or press OK. If you do that, the joystick changes its function once again. Basically, its function is dependent on what screen is showing in the gauge cluster, and it will darken the items that it can no longer do and illuminate new items when you go into each new screen, and that is a really cool touch. But the cruise control takes this even a step further. Look at the steering wheel, you'll notice there are no cruise controls on it, but they're there, they're just hidden. They don't light up until you press the button on the left to activate cruise control. And once you do, you can see all the cruise control buttons have now lit up and you can choose between them. But you turn off cruise control and they go away, which actually makes it pretty good. You don't want to be overwhelmed by all the buttons on your steering wheel. So some of them you can just turn off and they won't be right there complicating things. And next up, moving on to the center control stack in this car, my very favorite thing, aside from that gorgeous aviation style trim, is the font and display for the climate control temperature. Instead of using like those ugly 1980s clock face fonts, they actually have little screens in each temperature display to show what temperature it is. It's a small thing, but it makes it look way better and more modern. And there are these nice aluminum rocker switches you can use to control the temperature, which just feel fantastic, way better than plastic buttons that you see in so many other cars. Now, aside from the climate control display and those rocker switches, you have a fairly typical set of controls here, and it seems Lincoln has gone to great effort to make it as simple as possible and not overwhelming. I would argue actually a little too simple, because some important features are buried in the infotainment system. For example, you can't turn off auto stop start unless you press this button between the climate controls and then turn it off in the screen, and it's the same deal for auto hold, which is a feature I use all the time. You have to go into the screen. I would prefer those to be simple, easy to access buttons in the center control stack, but I guess they couldn't fit them. Now, next up, moving on to the center console area, fairly simple. You have these 2 little slider doors that open. One of them hides your cup holders, one of them has storage, and then you also have a big storage compartment in back under this leather armrest. But my very favorite thing in the center console is the drive mode selector button, and I especially like it because of what happens when you change the drive mode. Now, the first 2 are fairly normal. You have deep conditions for if you're driving through snow, and then you have slippery for like ice or maybe heavy rains. But the next 3 drive modes in the Aviator are rather interesting. The first one is called normal, and they define that in the gauge cluster as effortless and balanced. They just went looking for 2 words that perfectly sum up the experience. The next one is conserve, and it shows you a picture of the Earth. And next you move on to sport mode, which in the Aviator is called excite. And the words they've used to describe it are responsive and engaging. I'm not entirely sure why they felt the need to come up with words for each drive mode, but that's what they've done. And speaking of the gauge cluster, it's a full screen like so many gauge clusters are in luxury cars now, and it has a few interesting quirks of its own. Like, for example, you can adjust what's on the information screen. Pretty standard, and you can choose between trip, fuel economy, tire pressure, or my favorite, calm screen. So if you don't want like some information pointing at you and confusing you, just put on the calm screen, and then you don't have to look at any of that uncalm stuff. One other interesting item in the gauge cluster screen, if you go into settings, one of the things you can choose is border crossing, and then you can have the car alert you if you've just crossed a border. The car will say, hey, we're in Mexico now, in case you didn't see that giant booth with the customs agents where they took your passport, just FYI. Maybe it works for state borders too, so I'm not sure why that would be a configurable option, but it is. And next up, moving on to the infotainment system, which has a couple of quirks and features of its own. One is in vehicle settings, you can set the Aviator to have a maximum 30-minute idle time. So in other words, if the car is just idling and not doing anything for 30 minutes, it will automatically shut itself off if you have that setting checked. Very unusual. I guess they're worried about people accidentally leaving it running since it doesn't have a key that you insert. And another interesting infotainment system quirk, if you go into the display settings, you can turn off the infotainment screen, or once again, you can put it on a calm screen, and then it will just display the date and time, and it won't force all these different choices and buttons and menu options at you in order to make things a little bit more calm in the interior. As for the infotainment system itself, I played around with it for quite a while, and what I found is the screen is reasonably responsive. This would have been a fantastic system a couple of years ago, but now a few screens are more responsive than this one. Still, it's pretty good, not quite on the level of the best smartphones, but better than you'd expect for car screens if you haven't been in most of the modern luxury vehicles. I will say one drawback is for the navigation system, there's no destination entry pad like there is in BMWs or Audis, which means if you want to enter a destination, you have to type it in letter by letter using a keyboard like kind of in old school vehicles. The benefit is because it's a pretty responsive screen, it responds fairly quickly and you can type pretty fast, and then you can just set the destination and it will go. It doesn't really take that long, but those destination entry handwriting pads are kind of the rage now, and they're really useful. I would say that this infotainment system is fine, pretty good, not the best in the business by any means, but fairly good, and it will do exactly what you want it to do. And next up, moving on to the back seats of the Aviator into the second row. And once again, one of the first things you notice when you open the doors is just how nice it is back here. The quality of the leather, the stitching, the materials in the seats, on the door panel, everything just looks really, really nice. Now, there are a few cool things in the back of the Aviator, but probably the coolest is the fact that it has its own screen. It's on the back of the front center console, and it's a touch screen, just like the screen up front. Obviously, it's smaller than that, but it's still neat to see it. And there are several different functions. Starting with seats, you can use the screen to turn on the heated or cooled rear seats. Not too many SUVs have that, especially cooled in the back, but this one does. You can also use the screen to turn on audio or climate controls in the back seat. Pretty standard stuff there, nothing too interesting. But my personal favorite screen feature is in settings, where you can once again select calm screen. And if you do that, it shows you flying through clouds with the time displayed, because there's nothing more calming than flying through nice puffy clouds with blue skies. Now, here's an interesting thing about the clouds in the screens. The front screens do it too. When you turn off the Aviator, you can see that both the gauge cluster and the infotainment screen show a little display of you flying through clouds. And when you turn on the Aviator, the gauge cluster screen briefly displays you flying through clouds. So what is with all this cloud stuff? Well, remember, this is the Aviator. Aviator, aviation, flying, I guess that's supposed to tie them in, and so that's why there's a bunch of cloud stuff on these screens. But anyway, moving on to other interesting stuff in the back of the Aviator. This one has captain's chairs, 2 individual bucket seats back here. So in the middle, you have this giant center console. The one drawback I have with the back seats, though, is how the seats move. The front seats are these ultra crazy, perfect position, 30-way power seats. The back seats aren't power at all. To move them forward and backwards, it's a bar in the front. There's a plastic lever on the side. It's like they used all their power seat capabilities for the front seats and left nothing for the back. It's a bit of a surprise considering you have heated, ventilated seats back here and all these other controls to have no power movement at all. And since we're talking about the back seats, might as well discuss the third row, starting with just accessing the third row, which is quite simple. There's a little button on the tops of the second row seats. You press it, folds forward, you move it, and then you just climb in. It's that simple. Now, when it comes to actually climbing into the third row, obviously it was designed more for children, whereas I am a human adult. But I'm going to climb back there anyway, because that is what I do. Ugh. And so now I'm in the third row of the Aviator. And again, pretty tight back here, pretty small, pretty cramped for adults, but usable for children if you want to stick them back in the third row. Now, it's worth noting when you're in the third row, there's really nothing particularly interesting going on back here. It's just a standard third row seat. in a luxury SUV. Now, next up, moving on to the outside of the Aviator, and there's nothing particularly interesting with the lighting in this car like there is in some of the cars I review. In back, you have a big light bar that goes across the back, but that's becoming common on so many cars. Nothing really interesting back there. The only really noteworthy item with the lighting is the front turn signals, which are kind of set aside on their own in the bumper, and they have a pretty cool look to them when they turn on. I like that piece of lighting design. Now, speaking of lighting, it's also worth noting that this is one of those cars where the badge lights up, the Lincoln emblem in the grille, when you have the headlights on, which is just one of the stupidest things that has ever existed in the entire history of the automobile industry. Mercedes-Benz and Mazda do it too, and I sincerely hope it doesn't become a trend and spread to other automakers, but I deeply fear that that's exactly what is happening. Nonetheless, it does that, unfortunately. But I can forgive that flaw of the Aviator. In fact, I can forgive basically any flaw of the Aviator, not that it has very many, because of its design. Folks, I think this is one of the most beautiful vehicles on sale today. Certainly one of the most attractive SUVs on the market. They got it absolutely perfect. I feel the same way about the Aviator that I felt when the new Volvo XC90 came out a few years ago, and I rarely feel this way about cars. Usually they mess up some detail or a lot of details, but not this time. This is a gorgeous car, perfect proportions, absolutely handsome. They really got it right. And with that in mind, on to the back, and specifically on to the cargo area, where you can see it's fairly small back here, although pretty much standard for a 3-row SUV. In order to get real cargo space, you have to drop the 3rd row. If you do want extra cargo space, though, it's worth noting that underneath this load floor, there's a little spot where you can put stuff, and you can kind of keep it private because the load floor will cover it when you're parked. Now, if you want to drop the 3rd row, it's very simple. Just like in most modern luxury SUVs, you can power fold this 3rd row. There's a little button on the side to fold the left one, button on the side to fold the right one, or the button in the middle will fold them both at the same time. And you can also press all these buttons to bring them back up and into place, so you don't have to fumble with any latches or anything like that. Now, it is worth noting, though, that you can't fold the 2nd row of seats from back here. If you want to fold the 2nd row, you actually have to go around to each individual seat and fold them individually. There's no button or release back in the cargo area to drop the 2nd row of seats. And so those are the quirks and features of the 2020 Lincoln Aviator Black Label. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Aviator Black Label. I saw this car at the LA Auto Show like a year ago, and I've wanted to drive it ever since. It looked like a fantastic entrant into this segment, and it was just kind of proof that Lincoln wasn't a one-trick pony, that the Navigator wasn't the only thing they were capable of. Now, I will say, kind of poking around the car for the last few hours filming the start of this, I did notice the technology is not quite on the level of the very highest-end German brands. You know, the gauge cluster screen in the Audis is so good. The virtual cockpit is just so fantastic. And we're not on that level in this car. I noticed there's no 3rd row USBs. You can't fold the 2nd row from the cargo area. There's a couple of things that it's just not quite on that level. The German brands just focus so much on technology. They're just at the forefront of every new feature. The infotainment in this car isn't quite on the level. But the upside here is that the luxury and the trim and the look of everything is just nicer. I mean, there's no question. If you get in a GLE or an X5, this is a nicer interior than those cars. It looks better. There's no doubt about that. So there's a little bit of a trade-off situation. Now, the first thing you notice sitting in this car, it's very quiet in here. Surprisingly quiet, actually, for a midsize. You expect this from like a full-size Range Rover X7 Navigator, but this is nice and quiet. I hear the engine a little, and you might be able to hear it, but I have it in sport mode, or Excite, as they call it. Wow. Yeah, it's actually surprisingly quick. Ultimately, it's 400 horsepower. It's not really fast, but it's not slow. It definitely moves more than you might expect, considering it's a Lincoln and just a V6. I still wouldn't call it fast. It's no X5M, and I'm really looking forward to the plug-in version of this. The numbers are just ridiculous. 500 horsepower in a Lincoln crossover. That's the world we live in now. Really what Lincoln has done here, and in kind of a cool way, is they've looked at all these brands that are going sporty. Every Mercedes now is sporty. There's all these AMG models at a lower level. BMW is sporty. Everybody's trying to get you know, a different, you know, Cadillac has this edgy styling. They're trying to make themselves feel younger and hipper. And Lincoln has said, you know, there's a market still for people who want just luxury, fine craftsmanship, nice materials. And that's who they went after. And this might not be the highest tech car, although it's certainly sufficient. And it might not be the fastest, although again, it's sufficient, it drives fine. But it's probably the nicest on the inside. And they decided against pursuing that whole crowded, sporty luxury SUV segment and went their own way. And I think they're gonna benefit from it. And so that's the new Lincoln Aviator. I've driven the BMW X5. I've driven the Mercedes-Benz GLE, the Audi Q7, the Volvo XC90. I've driven them all. And if I were in the market for a 3-row luxury crossover, this is the one that I would get. Yes, it is expensive, and the Lincoln brand is hardly Audi or Mercedes-Benz or Land Rover, but this is a truly fantastic luxury SUV. And now it's time to give the Aviator a Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Aviator is truly handsome and it gets a 7 out of 10, which ties the Range Rover. It's the best score of any luxury SUV in this segment. Acceleration 0 to 60 is in 5.6 seconds, which gives it a 4 out of 10. Handling is average for the segment. It gets a 4 out of 10. Fun factor is low. It's fast and it's nice to drive, but it's not particularly engaging, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Finally, cool factor, and it's very cool right now. This was one of the most requested cars for me to review in 2019 based on tweets and emails and Instagram comments, and it gets a 5 out of 10, which is huge for a mid-size luxury crossover, for a total weekend score of 24 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. It's got a lot of great tech, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Comfort is excellent, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Quality is truly fantastic with a gorgeous interior, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Practicality is good, normal for a 3-row crossover, and it gets a 9 out of 10. Value is a little lower. The sticker price on this Aviator is around $81,000, which is worth it for an SUV that's this nice, but a lot of money for a Lincoln, especially considering resale value may not be as strong as key rivals. It gets a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 38 out of 100. Added up, and the Doug score is 62 out of 100, which places it here among some other luxury SUVs. You'll notice that the Aviator beats out the Navigator, and that's because it's basically just as nice, but better looking and faster and cheaper. I would only buy the Navigator over the Aviator if I needed the extra space. As for mid-size luxury SUVs, the Aviator is tied with the BMW X5 at the top, but the simple truth is this: if you want more driving engagement, get the X5. If you want more luxury, get the Aviator. This is probably the best Lincoln in my lifetime.